There is a rule in the Pack of Thornveil, old as the stone walls of its great hall, carved into the bark of the elder ash tree at the forest's edge in the language of the first wolves. An alpha does not show weakness. Not to enemies. Not to his warriors. Not even to the moon herself. So when Cassius, the Iron Alpha, the unyielding, the wolf whose name alone made rival packs reconsider their territorial ambitions, limped into the healing den clutching his left arm like a man who had narrowly survived a battle with a bear, everyone believed him. Everyone except the one person who actually looked at the wound. Her name was Wren, and she had been healing wolves since she was 12 years old, long enough to know what a week old bruise looked like. Long enough to know the difference between a tear in muscle and a graze that had already begun to close. Long enough to know when someone was performing. She said nothing. She pressed her palm to his arm, let her omega gift, warm, golden, quiet as candlelight, flow into the skin beneath her fingers, and she watched his face. Not a flicker of pain, not a single sharp intake of breath. But something else moved across that hard, jaw-clenched, infuriatingly handsome face. Something he clearly had not planned for. She filled that moment away like a healer files a symptom. Curious, suspicious, and deeply, deeply inconvenient. Because here is what Wren did not know yet, what she would not know until much later, when the truth fell out of him like a stone dropping into still water. Cassius had not been injured at all. He had walked into a doorframe. On purpose. 3 times. He had stood in the corridor outside the healing den for 7 full minutes working up the nerve to go inside. And the reason, the absurd, undignified, utterly un-alpha reason, was that for 3 months, every time Wren of the Low Hollow walked past him at pack assembly, something in his chest did something it had absolutely no right to be doing. This is that story. And it is, depending on your perspective, either the most romantic thing that has ever happened in Thornveil, or the most embarrassing. Possibly both. Chapter 1. To understand how any of this happened, you need to understand 2 things about the world of Thornveil. The first is the pack. The second is the rank. Thornveil was not a large pack by the standards of the Northern Territories. It held perhaps 300 wolves across the valley, hunters, forgers, weavers, sentinels, and the small, quiet order of healers who kept their den at the edge of the great forest, close enough to hear the river. They answered to a high alpha and his council. They trained their young. They held the borders. They buried their dead under the ash trees and sang the old songs and tried, mostly, not to die. It was a good life. A hard life. The kind of life that made people either very strong or very brittle. And then there was rank. Every wolf was born with a rank written into their blood, the howl of it encoded in the soul before the first breath. Alphas led. Betas enforced. Gammas tracked. And omegas. Omegas were the softest rank, or, so the old saying went, the gentlest, the most yielding. In truth, the gift of an omega healer was one of the rarest and most extraordinary things in the known territories. The ability to lay hands on a wound and pull the pain out of it like a splinter from skin, to feel another creature's body as if it were your own and guide it back toward wholeness, that was not softness. That was precision so fine it made swords look clumsy. But the old saying was older than reason, and people clung to it. Which is why Wren had spent most of her 22 years being dismissed by roughly half the pack and quietly revered by the other half. Healers always existed in that strange in-between, needed desperately, respected reluctantly, rarely invited to sit at the high table. She had made her peace with it. Mostly. Her healing den was 3 rooms. The main chamber where she saw patients, the back room where she dried and sorted her herbs, and the small sleeping nook separated from both by a heavy curtain. She had hung dried lavender from the ceiling beams and kept a fire that never quite went cold, and had a clay mug she was extremely attached to that said nothing on it because it was a mug and mugs do not speak, but she loved it anyway. She had 2 apprentices, a boy of 15 named Pip, who had an extraordinary gift and absolutely no confidence in it, and a young woman named Dia who had moderate gift and far too much confidence in everything, which balanced out in unexpected ways. This was Wren's world. Quiet, purposeful, occasionally eventful in the way that healers' worlds are eventful, which is to say, blood, bone, and the kind of conversations you have at someone's worst moments that you carry with you the rest of your life. She was not unhappy. She was also not paying any particular attention to Cassius Draven, which, by all accounts, was beginning to seriously irritate him. Cassius had become Alpha at 19, which was young, and he had spent the 6 years since then being entirely too good at it to be comfortable company. He was the kind of man people described differently, depending on who you asked. His warriors said he was fair. His council said he was decisive. His enemies said he was relentless. His housekeeper, an ancient woman named Brown who had no respect for rank and had been running the Alpha's residence for 30 years, said he needed to eat more and sleep better and, for the love of the moon, talk to someone who is not a war map. He was tall in the way that made doorways inconvenient, dark-haired, gray-eyed, and in possession of a jaw that seemed to have been carved for the express purpose of looking imperious. He laughed rarely and quietly, like someone who had learned early that laughter was a thing you protected. He ran a tight pack, a clean border, and a fair court. His wolves respected him. Some of them loved him in the way you love something you also slightly fear. He was not, in the estimation of anyone who had ever met him, a man prone to making foolish decisions. And yet, the trouble had started in the 2nd month of autumn, at the pack assembly where Wren had presented her annual healer's report to the council. He had seen her before, obviously. The Alpha knew all 300 of his wolves by name and face. It was his duty and his pride. He had spoken to her twice in official capacity. Once when he had approved the expansion of the healing den 2 years prior, and once when a border skirmish had left 4 of his wolves in her care, and he had come to check on them. Both times she had been entirely professional, informed, unsentimental in the way healers tended to be about injury and recovery. She had not seemed particularly impressed by him, which was unusual enough to be notable, but not unusual enough to be interesting. And then, at the autumn assembly, she had stood before the council table and delivered her healer's report in that clear, unhurried voice of hers, and at one point she had said, without looking up from her parchment, "The East Border Patrols are sustaining a disproportionate number of ankle injuries. I suspect the new patrol route crosses uneven terrain after the second ford. Someone who actually runs it should probably check." There had been a pause. Cassius had looked at his patrol commander. His patrol commander had looked at the ceiling. The ceiling had offered no assistance. "I'll look into it," Cassius had said. Wren had nodded like this was the correct and entirely predictable response, made a small mark on her parchment, and moved on to the incidents of winter fever. And Cassius had spent the rest of that meeting in the peculiar cognitive state of a man who has just been told something he should have already known, by someone who expected him to do better and finds, bewilderingly, that he does not mind. He had checked the patrol route the following morning. She was right. He rerouted it within the week. He did not tell her this.
He did not know why.
What he did do over the following weeks was notice her. The way you notice something once you have been pointed at it. At meals. At the weekly market. At the river crossing on gray mornings when the mist was still thick on the water. She was not remarkable in any dramatic way. She was of middling height, with brown skin that had a warmth to it even in winter, dark hair she kept pinned back though it never quite stayed, and the kind of eyes that made you feel, when they landed on you, like something was being assessed very efficiently. Cassius observed over several weeks of entirely dignified and not at all suspicious noticing, had an opinion about everything, expressed to whoever was present, regardless of rank. He watched her argue with a beta twice her size about the proper way to set a broken finger. He watched her calmly redirect a merchant who was trying to sell her diluted tinctures in terms that made the merchant go pale. He watched her, once, sit on the ground next to a wolf child who had badly scraped her knee and talk to the child through the entire healing process with complete seriousness, like the child's pain was the only thing in the world that mattered right now. And that last one, had done something to the inside of his chest that he found deeply inconvenient and chose not to examine. He was an alpha. He had a pack of 300 to think about. He had border negotiations and resource allocation, and 3 separate council members who disagreed about everything and expressed this by arguing loudly at every meeting. He did not have time for this. He was also, it must be said, completely out of practice. 6 years of being the most powerful wolf in the valley had not done wonders for his social skills in contexts where power was irrelevant. He was fine at negotiations. He was fine at commands. He was significantly less fine at the specific challenge of being a person who wanted to talk to another person and had no war-related reason to do so. His beta, a man named Fun, who had been his closest friend since they were 7 years old and had therefore earned the right to be insufferable, had noticed approximately none of this because Fun was perceptive about enemies and completely oblivious to everything happening directly in front of him. His housekeeper Brone, on the other hand, had noticed everything because Brone noticed everything and had begun leaving extra pastries on the table in the mornings with the specific energy of a woman with opinions she was restraining by force of will alone. Things continued in this manner, Cassius quietly observing, Wren going about her life in magnificent indifference for 3 months. And then came the doorframe. Chapter 2. It began, as many ill-conceived plans do, with a very plausible-sounding excuse. The truth was that Cassius had been awake until the second bell of morning on a night that offered no council meetings, no border reports, and no administrative emergencies of any kind. Just the fire burning low in his study and the honest, uncomfortable realization that he had been inventing reasons to be near the healing den's general vicinity for the better part of a fortnight. He had passed by it 3 times in 2 days under separate pretexts, once to speak to the supply master, whose office happened to be nearby, once on a perimeter check that was extremely thorough in that particular direction, and once on what could only be described as a walk, which was not a thing he did because he was an alpha, and alphas had destinations. It was the walk that had done it. Somewhere between the market square and the river road, standing in the autumn cold feeling fully idiotic, he had arrived at the conclusion that he needed to go to the healing den for an actual reason. A dignified one. One that would not require him to explain anything to anyone. He needed, in short, to be injured. He stood in his corridor at the first bell of morning and thought about this for a long time. He was not, he decided, actually going to injure himself. That was excessive and also frankly embarrassing as a strategy. But the encounter needed to look plausible. A bruise, perhaps. Something recent. Nothing serious. He managed, with some creative use of a doorframe and a cabinet corner, to produce a bruise on his left forearm that was impressive-looking and completely superficial. It hurt more than he had anticipated, which he felt was karmic. He wrapped it loosely. He rehearsed, briefly and with deep self-awareness that this was not a thing he would ever speak of aloud, a few natural-sounding opening lines. He went to the healing den at mid-morning. He stood outside it for 7 minutes.
He went in.
The den smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and something faintly sweet that he could not immediately name. Honey, maybe, or the particular resin she used in her salves. It was warm, quieter than the rest of the pack grounds, somehow, as if the walls kept out not just cold but noise. Wren was at the long work table in the main chamber, grinding something in a clay mortar, and she looked up when he entered with the expression of someone whose morning had just taken an unexpected turn. Alpha. Healer. There was a pause in which Cassius became acutely aware that he had not actually planned what came next. He held up the arm. There was a training incident. She looked at the arm. Then she looked at him. Something very brief moved through her expression that he could not quite name.
Come in, she said.
Sit. The examination table was a solid, low wooden thing with a worn surface and a cushion that had seen better decades. He sat on it and extended his arm, and she crossed from the work table to stand before him, wiping her hands on the cloth tucked into her belt. She took his arm in both hands. Her grip was light but certain, the grip of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped being polite about it. He felt the warmth begin immediately. The Omega gift was something Alphas did not often experience directly. Healers were called in for serious injury, not inspected out of personal curiosity, and it was disorienting in a way he had not anticipated. Like being immersed in something that was not quite heat and not quite light but moved through the tissue of him like water through cracks, finding every tense and guarded place, and simply settling there. He kept his face still. He was very practiced at keeping his face still. What he was less practiced at was managing what was happening in his chest, which was approximately 3 layers deeper than his face, and considerably less controlled. Her hands were warm. Her focus was complete. She wasn't looking at him the way most wolves looked at him, wary, deferential, performing some version of themselves that they thought an alpha wanted to see. She was looking at his arm like it was a problem to be understood. That was all. Just the arm. Just the problem. It lasted about 45 seconds before she said, without any particular inflection, "This is a few days old." He said nothing. "The tissue is already stabilized." She pressed 2 fingers lightly along the inside of his forearm. "And it's quite shallow. You didn't need to come in for this." I wanted to be cautious. She looked up at him then.
Directly.
The way she had looked at the council table that first time. She said. It was not agreement. It was not exactly disagreement. It was the specific syllable of someone who had just filed something in a mental folder labeled to be investigated later and was choosing, for now, to simply continue working. She applied something cool and faintly aromatic, a salve from a small clay pot, and wrapped the arm neatly in linen. "Come back if it swells," she said, releasing him. She had already turned back toward her work table before the sentence was finished. Cassius sat for a moment on the examination table. The warmth of the healing was fading slowly, like the last light of an ember. He was aware he should leave. He was also aware, with a particular awareness of someone who has not quite gotten what they came for and cannot articulate exactly what that was, that he did not especially want to. "The ankle injuries on the East Patrol," he said, which was not what he had intended to say at all. She paused in her grinding. "What about them?" "I rerouted the patrol 2 months ago after you mentioned it." Before we continue, I'd like you to let me know in the comment section where you are currently watching this story from. Also, do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button for more interesting werewolf romance stories. She turned, looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but adjacent to it. "I know," she said. Pip rolled his ankle on the old route the week before and didn't on the new one. "I wondered. I should have caught it sooner." "Probably," she agreed, without cruelty. "But you caught it." She tilted her head slightly, considering him with an expression that was now openly curious, less like she was assessing his injury and more like she was assessing something else entirely. "Is there something else?" "No," he said. "It was technically true." He left. He walked back through the market square and up to the Alpha residence and sat in his study for a considerable time, doing nothing of administrative value, which was extremely unlike him and suggested, if nothing else, that things had gotten significantly worse. He came back 4 days later. Different arm. A sparring bruise, this one. Genuinely earned. He had been rather more reckless than usual in morning sparring and had gotten a short staff to the ribs, which had produced a bruise that was completely real, moderately painful, and entirely his own fault. He told himself this made it better. It did not especially make it better. Wren looked at the bruise. She looked at him.
Sparring, he said. I can see that, she said.
Sit down. The healing was longer this time. Ribs were more complex than a forearm, and she spent several minutes with both hands pressed flat against his side, working through the layers of muscle and bone with that focused, unhurried attention. He was not, on this occasion, performing pain. The ribs did hurt, and the relief as her gift drew the inflammation out of them was genuine and involuntary and somewhat more visible on his face than he would have preferred. Breathe, she said quietly. He breathed. You're holding your whole left side, even the parts I've already done. Force of habit, bad habit. I have several. She glanced up briefly. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but almost. Something lighter than her default professional composure. This will be tender for a few days, she said, sitting back. Don't spar on it. I have training in the morning. Then spar left-sided and take the staff hit somewhere else. That's tactically awkward. So is cracking a rib the rest of the way and having to explain to your pack why their alpha has limited range of movement. She met his eyes steadily. Your choice. He considered arguing. He was an alpha. He argued with council members who had 30 years of experience. He negotiated with river lords who had entire fleets at their disposal.
Fine, he said.
She nodded like this was, again, the correct and entirely predictable response. He left without saying anything else. He walked back through the market square. He thought about the almost smile. He was in very serious trouble. Chapter 3. Wren was not oblivious. She had been healing wolves for a decade. She had seen every variety of patient, the stoic ones, the dramatic ones, the ones who minimized injuries until they became crises, and the rare, fascinating ones who arrived with ailments that were somewhat less medical than they appeared. Cassius Draven, Alpha of Thornveil, iron-jawed and unreadable, had come to her den twice in 4 days with injuries that were, in her professional assessment, entirely survivable without intervention. He had also, both times, lingered approximately 3 times longer than the treatment required.
She thought about this.
She ground her herbs. She organized her stock. She walked Pip through the theory of a chest poultice and corrected Daya's herb measurements twice and made her claypot tea and thought about it some more. You're doing that thing, Daya said on the second afternoon. What thing? The thing where you stare at the ceiling and pretend you're thinking about something medicinal. I am thinking about something medicinal. You're thinking about the alpha. Wren set down her mortar. I am thinking about a patient's treatment. Daya, who was 19 and had the self-preservation instincts of someone who had recently come under Wren's supervision and had not yet learned when to stop, raised both eyebrows and said nothing in a very loud way. He came in with a 3-day-old bruise, Wren said, because apparently she was going to talk about this now. A healer's first year could have assessed it in 30 seconds. So, he's not seriously injured.
No.
But he keeps coming.
Twice.
He's come twice. In 4 days. Wren looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was unhelpful. Ceilings never were. The thing was, and she turned this over carefully the way she turned a complex symptom, looking at it from every angle, the thing was that he wasn't awkward about it. He wasn't flirtatious in any obvious way. He wasn't trying to charm her, which was perhaps the most interesting part, because powerful men who wanted things generally did try to charm people, and it generally made her tired. He just came in. sat on the table, let her work, looked at her like he was paying attention to something specific, and had not entirely decided what it was yet. And then, as he'd been leaving the second time, there had been that comment about the patrol route. That particular, "I wanted you to know that I listened." Quiet, directed at her specifically. Not performance. Not politics. She did not especially know what to do with any of this. She was a healer, not a what, exactly? She wasn't naive. She understood what attraction was. She had felt it before, in measured, manageable ways that she had dealt with and set aside, because a healer's den was not the place for entanglements, and she had her work and her apprentices and her clay mug. Cassius Draven was the alpha of the pack, and he had walked into a door frame. She was now fairly confident it was a door frame, to get bruised enough to have a reason to come see her. She didn't know whether to be charmed or bewildered. Currently she was both, which was inconvenient. "If he comes back," Dia said helpfully, "with another mysteriously minor injury, you are going to continue preparing that poultice and keep your observations to yourself." "Absolutely," Dia agreed, and continued making observations with her expression instead, which was entirely out of Wren's jurisdiction. He came back. Of course he came back. This time it was a week later, on a gray afternoon when the first real cold of winter had come in off the northern mountains, and the pack grounds were quiet, and the fire in her den was burning hot. He knocked, which none of her regular patients did. They simply walked in, but he knocked, and said when she opened the door, "I may have aggravated the ribs." She looked at him. He looked back. "May have," she said. "There was a sparring situation. You said you wouldn't spar on it." "I said I would spar left-sided." The situation did not cooperate. She opened the door wider and gestured him in. This time, when she pressed her hands to his ribs, she felt the truth of it. There was genuine ache there, deeper than before, the kind that came from repeated stress rather than new injury. He had been pushing through it. She worked more slowly than usual, following the discomfort through the muscles, and he was quiet in a way that felt, this time, less like controlled composure and more like something close to comfort. Like a body that was not used to being still finally going still. "You're always like this, aren't you?" she said. "Like what?" "Wound tight. Even when you're not." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was slightly different, less formal. More considered. "It's the position. You stop turning it off. That sounds exhausting. You get used to it. Do you?" She shifted her hands slightly, feeling the response in the tissue beneath. "Or do you just stop noticing that you're tired?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not a question I hear often," he said. "No," she agreed. "I suspect not." She finished the treatment. She sat back. And this time, instead of wrapping his arm or binding his ribs, she just rested her hands in her lap and looked at him and said the thing she had been thinking all week. The first bruise was 3 days old. He met her eyes. He didn't deny it. "You don't have to keep pretending to be hurt," she said. "If there's something you want to talk about." The silence that followed was long enough to be interesting. She watched something happen behind his gray eyes, a calculation or a choice, or both at once. "I'm not accustomed," he said slowly, "to not having a reason, a formal reason, for things, for talking to someone, for any of it." He paused. "It's a structural failing." "I'm not accustomed," he said slowly, "to not having a reason, a formal reason, for things, for talking to someone, for any of it." He paused. "It's a structural failing." She considered this. It was, she thought, one of the most honest things anyone had said to her in months, and it had come from a man who could have simply said nothing and used his rank to make the conversation disappear. "Well," she said, "if it helps, I am a healer. You don't need a reason to come in. That's the entire premise." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but she could see it because she was used to reading subtle changes in bodies under her hands, and his face was, in the end, just another body doing something it had not quite decided yet. "Even if there's nothing wrong," he said. "Even then." He nodded. A small, quiet nod. The kind a man makes when he has been handed something he wasn't expecting and needs a moment to carry it properly.
He left.
But he didn't put his collar back on the way he usually did, that deliberate, closed-off set to his shoulders that he wore like armor. He left with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw unclenched. She noticed. Healers notice things. She also noticed that she was, for no medicinally justifiable reason, smiling at the door after he had gone through it. Chapter 4. He came back without an injury 4 days later. She had her back to the door when he knocked, and she said, "Come in," without turning, because she was halfway through a delicate process of straining an infusion, and the timing mattered, and then she said, without looking, "There's a chair next to the work table." A pause. Then the sound of him crossing the room, and the particular sound of a large man sitting down in a chair that was not designed with large men in mind. "You knew it was me," he said. "Your knock is different." "I knock." "Exactly." She finished the straining, set the cloth aside, and turned to lean against the table, wiping her hands. He was sitting in the small wooden chair looking slightly too large for it, but making no indication that this was problematic because he was the kind of person who would simply sit in whatever chair was offered and not mention the inconvenience. "Pitt made tea this morning," she said. "It's still warm. It tastes like a forest floor in the most interesting possible way because he oversteeped it, but it's warm. I'll have some." She poured 2 cups. She sat on a low stool on the other side of the work table, and they sat with the fire and the drying herbs and the gray winter light from the single high window, and she thought, this is the strangest thing that has happened in a long time. He wrapped both hands around the cup, looked into it for a moment. "I didn't have a reason," he said, "for coming here. Not a medical one." "I know. I mean, from the beginning. The first time." "I know," she said again, without judgment. He looked up. She watched him working through what came next in that methodical, careful way of his, like he was assessing terrain before moving through it. "The arm was a door frame," he said. She kept her face entirely still. She managed it for about 4 seconds. The sound she made was not a laugh exactly. It was the sound a laugh makes when it is being very firmly restrained and only partially succeeding. He watched her. Something moved in his expression, mortification, and under it, something warmer. "A door frame," she said. "Twice," he said, which made it significantly worse and somehow significantly better. She pressed her hand over her mouth. The sounds she was making were not compatible with professional composure. "You twice." "And a cabinet corner," he said, with the tone of a man delivering a final confession and accepting his fate. That was the end of the professional composure. She laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that requires you to set down your teacup before you spill it, which she did, and put both hands over her face, and he watched her with that expression she had never quite seen on him before. Embarrassed, yes, but also something lighter, something like relief. Like a man who has been carrying a secret that turned out to be absurd rather than terrible, and is only now beginning to find that funny. "I'm sorry," she said, not very convincingly. "I'm sorry. That is impressive commitment. It was not my finest strategic decision."
"No."
She was still laughing, quieter now, her eyes bright with it. "Why didn't you just come in? You're the alpha." "That's precisely the problem." He set his cup down, looked at her steadily. "You don't look at me like I'm the alpha." She went quiet, not uncomfortably, just carefully, attending to what he was saying the way she attended to a symptom. "And that's the thing," he continued, in that slow, deliberate way of his, like each word was being chosen rather than just happening. "Everyone in the pack has an idea of me. A thing they're looking at when they look at me. The rank, the position, the years of it. I don't know what's left when you take that out, and most of the time I don't need to know because it doesn't come up. He paused. And then I watch you tell a council table that a patrol route is badly designed, and it doesn't appear to have occurred to you to be careful about it, and I can't.
He stopped.
She waited. I couldn't stop thinking about it, he said. About how you were. You just said the thing. You looked at the problem and you said the thing. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the ash trees, and the fire crackled, and somewhere in the back room Pip was probably doing something creative and medically questionable with the herb stock. You came to my den 3 times with fake injuries, she said, because you find directness attractive. That is, he stopped. Exhaled. A reductive summary. But not wrong. He looked at her steadily. But not wrong, he agreed. She picked her teacup back up, looked into it for a moment. The fire was warm. The room smelled like lavender and wood smoke. Outside, the gray afternoon was sliding toward evening. For what it's worth, she said, you're also not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who liked being told things less. She tilted her head. And who was worse at sitting still? He glanced down at himself, as though checking. I'm sitting still. I know. You're terrible at it, and you're doing it anyway. She met his eyes. That's the part one find interesting. The quiet that followed was different from the ones before, warmer, less careful. Like 2 people who have been navigating around something and have finally just agreed to stop. The tea genuinely tastes like a forest floor, he said. I know. Pip has promise, but no patience. You get used to it. Chapter 5. He came back every week after that. Not for injuries. Not for ailments. Not for anything Wren could file under a medical heading except possibly prevention in the loosest possible sense. Prevention of the specific, quiet damage that comes from carrying a pack of 300 wolves for 6 years without anyone who would simply sit across from you and say the thing. He sat in the small chair that was not designed for him. She sat on the stool. Sometimes they talked about pack matters. She had opinions, consistent with being someone who dealt with the consequences of pack decisions more directly than most, and he listened with that complete, disconcerting attention of his, and sometimes she could see a decision changing shape in his mind while she watched. Sometimes they talked about nothing in particular. Pip's apprenticeship, a particular difficult plant she was trying to cultivate, the way the East Mountains looked at dawn. He fixed the patrol routes. All 4 of them. She found this out from Pip, who found it out from a beta, who mentioned it in passing. Cassius said nothing about it. She said nothing either, but she left an extra cup of the less forest-flavored tea on the table the next time he came in. He noted it. His mouth did the thing it did sometimes, not quite a smile, but the close vicinity of one. The pack noticed, because packs notice everything and manage it mostly through gossip. Brown, the housekeeper, started leaving pastries in 2s. Thun, the beta, stared at Cassius for a long time one morning over the war table, and then opened his mouth, and then closed it again, and chose a tactical retreat. Dia made absolutely no effort to hide her opinions, and had to be assigned a complicated herb inventory to keep her occupied. Winter proper arrived and covered the pack grounds in snow, and the healing den was warm and full of the smell of winter herbs and the particular medicine that is simply having somewhere to be that is quiet and honest and doesn't require a performance. On a morning in deep winter, when Cassius had come by on no particular pretext and was sitting with his cup of tea while Wren catalogued her stock with the systematic focus she brought to everything, he said, I owe you an apology. She glanced at him. For the door frame? For the dishonesty of it. Coming in under a false pretext. She was quiet for a moment. She moved a bundle of dried rosemary from one shelf to another, considering. You know what the first thing a healer learns is? She said. What? That people who are in pain very rarely come in and say, "I'm in pain and I need help." They come in with something else.
Something they can point to.
Something manageable. She looked at him. "You came in with a bruise. There was a real thing underneath it."
She paused.
"That's not dishonesty. That's just being human." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the snow was falling, soft and constant, and the fire was steady, and the pack was going about its winter mourning.
"I don't do this well," he said.
"Whatever this is." "You're doing it right now," she said. "This is sitting in a chair in your workroom." "Yes," she said simply. "That's what I said." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were, she had come to believe, considerably warmer than anyone who had not sat across from him in a small healer's den had ever been given the chance to see. "The patrol commissioner thinks I've gone strange," he said. "I'm apparently harder to read than usual." "Are you?" She tilted her head. "Or are you just harder to intimidate?"
He thought about this.
"The second one," he said, with something that was unmistakably and entirely without restraint, a smile. She'd known it would change his face. She'd been right. "You should do that more," she said. "What?" "That." He looked briefly uncertain, which was an expression she had a feeling almost no one ever saw on him, and which she found. And this was her honest, unmedical, entirely personal assessment. Rather devastating. "I'll consider it," he said. "Noted," she said, and went back to her shelf with the particular composure of a woman who is being carefully professional and is succeeding at approximately 70% of it. Outside, the snow kept falling over Thornveil. Inside, the fire kept burning. Pip was almost certainly doing something questionable in the back room. Daya's running commentary on the herb inventory had taken on the specific energy of someone trying very hard not to say anything. And Cassius Draven, Alpha of Thornveil, Iron Wolf, unyielding, sat in the small chair in the healer's den drinking tea that tasted like a forest floor, in a room that smelled like lavender and wood smoke and winter herbs, and was, for the first time in longer than he could precisely account for, simply, quietly, without performance or armor or the weight of 300 wolves. At ease. It had taken a door frame, and a cabinet corner, and a healer who looked at problems directly and said the thing. But here he was. The ash trees outside held their snow. The river ran under its skin of ice. The pack of Thornveil went on being a pack, messy, living, loud, full of the specific complicated beauty of 300 wolves trying to share a valley. And in the healing den at the edge of the great forest, two people sat across from each other in the firelight and were, neither of them quite yet ready to say it, already something to each other. That is its own kind of medicine, the kind that doesn't come in a jar.